What's happening, everybody? UFC 303, it's taking place this week, and we've had a bunch of changes to the card, but it's going to be a good one. We got a lot of fun fights, especially the main event, Jiri Procházka taking on Alex Pereira in the rematch. In this video, I'm going to break down everything that you need to know to build some winning DraftKings lineups. I also have a few bets that I placed. We'll be talking about those over the course of the video, so do me a favor as you're watching. Like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Also, we have a giveaway to do, including announcing the winner from last week's giveaway. So what we did last week was try to guess how many fantasy points Robert Whittaker would score and giving away a free Odd Shopper subscription to the person who got closest to the right answer. And a bet that I had on last week's card was Robert Whittaker minus 135 on the money line. Alaska Jeff took that. He picked Whittaker to win and picked him to score 104 fantasy points. Whittaker finished with 105. So you were the closest to the pin here, Alaska Jeff. So DM me on Twitter and I'll get you set up with a link to get yourself a free Odd Shopper subscription for this week. Which fighter priced 7,900 or below scores the most fantasy points? Leave a comment below. And the person who gets the answer correct, or if there's multiple people, I'll randomize it and we'll get one person to get a free Odd Shopper subscription. But, since it's a pay-per-view card, UFC 303, if multiple people get the answer right, then I'll do up to 3 people get a free subscription. So give yourself a chance to win. Just leave a comment below. Which fighter priced 7,900 or under scores the most fantasy points this weekend? But let's start breaking down the card, beginning with our main event for UFC 303. It is the rematch between Alex Pereira and Jiri Procházka. And we did see these two fight a year ago, and it was very competitive. I know that the fight ultimately ended with Alex Pereira knocking out Jiri Procházka in the second round, but for a lot of the fight, Jiri Procházka was the one who was winning the minutes. He was the one who was advancing. I do view this as very close to a 50-50 fight. If you go ahead and look at some of the numbers from the first time these two fought, what does stand out the most is some of the success that Jiri Procházka did have in the wrestling department. In the first round, he landed a takedown. He also had a little bit over 2 minutes of control time. So nearly half of the first round of that fight was with Jiri Procházka having control time over Alex Pereira. And then what we saw in the second round of the fight was Yuri's legs were a little bit beaten up in the first round, and he just kind of decided, screw it, moving forward, pressuring Alex Pereira. And he did a lot of good work on the feet. It actually did look like Jiri had hurt Pereira a couple of times, but then ultimately it was Pereira who landed the big left hook that put Procházka down. And then it was kind of a controversial stoppage by Mark Goddard. With that said, Jiri did get on the mic afterwards and said that he thought that it was a good stoppage and he agreed with the referee. It's a fight that I thought was very competitive the first time. I think it's going to be really competitive this time as well, close to a coin flip 50-50. So with that being the case, and me also thinking the winner of this fight should score well, and it is a fight priced in the mid-range, I've got this fight in pretty much all my lineups. I'm leaning a little bit more towards Jiri because of, number one, he's expected to be a little bit less popular and he's also cheaper. But ultimately, I've got 58% of Jiri. I've got 41% of Pereira here. It's a really good fight to target. I'll be a little bit heavier on the Jiri side. I don't really have a confident pick for the winner, but forced to pick one for the purposes of this show here. I'm going to go Jiri Procházka, second round finish. So I'm going to say Jiri gets the finish in the second round this time, as opposed to Pereira getting the finish in the second round. Co-main event, another fight that I'm really looking forward to and another really great one to target for DraftKings purposes. A little bit of drama involved. We've got Brian Ortega taking on Diego Lopez. So the fight did come together on late notice. One of the main reasons that it was booked on late notice was just to bolster the card. Because as you guys know, it was originally supposed to be Conor McGregor against Michael Chandler in the main event. And then once that fell out, the UFC was like, shit, we really got to put some stuff together to make this an appealing fight for the fans. And what they did was they booked a great fight between Ortega and Diego Lopez at 145 pounds, but it ends up being with the fight being on short notice. Ortega wasn't able to make 145 pounds. So late last night, they changed it to a 155-pound fight. I don't think it's going to make a massive difference on the fight here, other than just something that I kind of already suspect to be the case here. Neither of these fighters, I think, are going to necessarily be in top form cardio-wise for this fight, especially on the Ortega side. And given that these are two action fighters, I think they go to war. And I think somebody gets finished in the first or second round. I'm going to lean a little bit more towards the side of Diego Lopez. He is 3 years younger. And I also think he's a little bit cleaner of a striker than Brian Ortega. I also think he has more power on the feet. Ortega's probably a little bit more likely to land takedowns, considering that we've seen Diego Lopes only with a 42% takedown defense in his career, and also is not somebody who's looked to wrestle in his fights. So if this does get to the mat, I think it's probably Ortega in top position, but on the feet, I'm going to give Diego Lopes the advantage. He's a little bit more expensive on DraftKings as well. Great fight to target in the mid-range. That's also where a lot of my lineups are being built. I'm not really going stars and scrubs a lot for this slate. I really like a lot of these mid-range fights, this being one of them along with the main event. So I've got Ortega right now in 37% of lineups, Diego Lopes in 36%. The only reason I have Ortega in a little bit more lineups, even though I am picking Lopes to win by finish, is just because of the price differential between the two. But great fight to target. If I was building a single entry lineup right now, I would have Diego Lopes in it as opposed to Brian Ortega. Next fight that we have on the card, it is another late notice fight between Anthony Smith and Roman Dolidze. This was a fight that was originally supposed to be Jamal Hill taking on, who was it? So the original one, it was Jamal Hill against Khalil Roundtree. And then there were so many opponent changes that somehow that fight became Anthony Smith and Roman Dolidze, who were not either of the original two fighters booked. The fight ended up changing like 5 times. And this is kind of what Anthony Smith's career has been over the last few years. He almost exclusively takes some of these short notice fights on big cards, and he's compensated well for it. On the other side, he's going to be fighting Roman Dolidze, who is not a light heavyweight. We've always seen Roman Dolidze fight at 185 pounds. And with that being the case, it's kind of hard to know what he's going to look like at 205 pounds. If we do assume that he's able to fill in well at the weight class, I think it does set up as a pretty good matchup for him because Anthony Smith really struggles to defend takedowns, 49% takedown defense. He often is willing to just accept takedowns and play off his back. And then you have somebody in Roman Dolidze who's really, really dangerous on the ground, both in terms of his ground and pound, as well as his submission ability. The only question really becomes to me here is how well does Roman Dolidze's game translate from 205 pounds when he's accustomed to fighting at 185 pounds? So it's a really big gap in weight classes. So it is a fight that I do think probably finishes inside the distance. If the size of Anthony Smith is just too much for Roman Dolidze to handle, I could certainly see Anthony Smith having a strength advantage on the ground where he's able to have some grappling success. But if Roman Dolidze is able to land takedowns and get in top position, I think that he could have grappling success and end up either submitting or ground and pound finishing Anthony Smith. So another really good fight to target. I currently have Dolidze in 32% of my lineups and Anthony Smith in 27%. Anthony Smith, definitely a contrarian play to look at. He's only projected for ownership in the teens, but I am overweight to both sides of the fight at the moment, which is the case for pretty much all of the mid-range fights on this card. Next one we have here, it is another really important fight to talk about for DFS purposes, because we've got Macy Chiasson taking on Mayra Bueno Silva, and I do regret not looking into this fight sooner because Mayra Bueno Silva opened up as a pretty substantial betting favorite, and that immediately got hammered. So we now have Macy Chiasson, only $7,400 as the slight betting favorite to win the fight. And I do agree with the line movement and the market here because Mayra Bueno Silva is not a minutes winner. She's very reliant on getting finishes, and those finishes that she's relying on are typically submission finishes. If you look at her UFC run, look at all of her wins. So I know this ended up being overturned to a no contest because Mayra Bueno Silva tested positive for Adderall, but still it was a second round submission finish for her against Lena Landsberg, second round submission finish against Stephanie Egger, first round submission finish against Wu Yanan. She did have a decision win. Her other wins in the UFC against Mara Romero Barella, that was a submission win. Against Jillian Robertson, submission win. And then on the Contender Series against Mayana Kellum, that was also a submission win. So you have a fighter here in Mayra Bueno Silva who, if she wins, it almost exclusively comes by submission. Here's the problem now, though. She rarely shoots takedowns and only lands 0.68 takedowns per 15 minutes. You see the issue here. How reliably can you project somebody to win by submission when they don't look to shoot takedowns? So what's often happened is, like against Holly Holm, she ends up getting a submission up against the cage where there wasn't even a takedown involved. Or you get into some of these situations where somebody takes her down, she reverses position, ends up getting on top. It's just really low outcome propositions, especially against higher level opponents. And that kind of is what I consider Macy Chiasson to be relative to other fighters in this weight class. So in the last fight we saw from Mayra Bueno Silva, she looked decent in the early going against Raquel Pennington, but she only had like a round and a half of cardio. Then she gassed out, and Pennington just looked really good and cruised the rest of the fight. So I have to favor Macy Chiasson to win. I think Macy Chiasson has a striking advantage. I do think Mario Bueno Silva is the better grappler, but it doesn't really matter all that much if Mario Bueno Silva isn't going to have top position. It's hard for me to project her to do that, considering that she doesn't shoot takedowns. So I'm going to pick Macy Chiasson to win. I think she does win by decision. And considering that she's $7,400 as the betting favorite, she's going to be very popular. See here, we have her project for 37% ownership. I am still slightly overweight to that mark, having her in 40% of lineups. There is an argument for Mario Bueno Silva as a leverage contrarian option because she is going to be so low owned and Macy Chiasson is going to be so popular. And then on top of that, like we said, when Mario Bueno Silva wins, it typically is by submission. But I'm going to be siding a little bit more with the Macy Chiasson side. I'll be taking some shots on Mario Bueno Silva in large field tournaments, but more so I will be on Macy Chiasson this weekend. And call me a chalk donkey here, but that's also just kind of how I read the fight. I have to pick Macy Chiasson to win the way that I break down some of my fights. Next fight here, Ian Machado Garry against Michael Venom Page. And this is a fight that I have a bet on. First bet that I'm going to give out here on the show. I did bet Ian Machado Garry plus 900 to win by submission. You could bet him plus 900 on FanDuel. He's plus 1,000 over on DraftKings. Just the limits are really low on DraftKings, so it limited how much money I could get on that particular prop on DK. But I think it's something that's being way overlooked by the market because if this fight takes place on the feet, it's very competitive. It could go in either direction, in my opinion. And also, it could kind of suck if it plays out on the feet. If you guys remember the fight Michael Page had against Kevin Holland, his UFC debut, the significant strike totals, Michael Venom Page landed 41 significant strikes. Kevin Holland landed 29. Not that much happened in the fight. Kevin Holland was able to land 2 takedowns, though. And that's where I think Ian Machado Garry should be able to recognize that in the striking, it's either going to be competitive or he might even be at a slight disadvantage. But if he does look to wrestle aggressively, he has a massive grappling advantage over Michael Venom Page. And that's a scenario where not only could we see Garry win, and also why I'm betting the long odds prop on him to win by submission. But that's also a scenario where he could score really well for DraftKings purposes. He's also not all that popular. There's a massive, massive public dislike of Ian Machado Garry, and I think that is going to play into people just not wanting to roster him in DFS. So if he does look to wrestle, which I think is the smart game plan here, then I think he could put up a big score in the mid-range. I have Garry in 31% of lineups right now. He's projected for 26% ownership. I wouldn't even mind being a little bit higher than that. On the Venom Page side, you can make a case that he's live for an early knockout. I just don't think that's the most likely proposition. And if he doesn't get that first round knockout, considering how low volume he has as a striker, I think he probably scores pretty poorly for DraftKings purposes. So I'm going to pick Ian Garry to win. I'm going to pick him by submission as well. I think he gets a submission in the first or second round as long as he comes out with a wrestling heavy game plan. Joe Pyfer taking on Marc-Andre Barriault. And I think the term fraud check gets used a little bit too liberally in the UFC space, where a lot of people see hype prospects, they lose, which is kind of inevitable. Most people don't go undefeated over the course of their career. And immediately the reaction is fraud checked. This guy is not a for real prospect. But I don't really quite feel that way about Joe Pyfer. I think what we did find out in that fight is that he doesn't have the best cardio in the world, but I still think he's somebody who is going to put up a lot of big DraftKings scores, and I do think he can be somebody who competes with some of the top-ranked fighters in the 185-pound division, and he did look good in the early going against Jack Hermansson, but Hermansson puts a pace on guys, and that is something that Marc-Andre Barriault could replicate to some respect, but I don't think he could do it quite the same way that Jack Hermansson can. And then also, this is a 3-round fight as opposed to a 5-round fight. Marc-Andre Barriault also has some questionable durability. We've seen him finished on a handful of occasions. So you look at Marc-Andre Barriault, he was submitted by Anthony Hernandez. He was KO'd by Chidi and Chiquani, and those are 2 of his last 3 losses. And I do think of all the fighters that he's faced in recent memory, that Joe Pyfer is the best finisher of all of them. So I do think the most likely scenario here is that Joe Pyfer does finish Marc-Andre Barriault in the first or second round. I think he could do it on the feet. I think he could also do it in the wrestling and grappling department. The only problem I have with rostering a ton of Joe Pyfer is that, like I said, I am more prioritizing building my lineups in the mid-range. So that did really limit the amount of Joe Pyfer I was able to get to. I only have him in 24% of lineups. There aren't that many cheap fighters I like outside of Macy Chiasson this week. So Joe Pyfer, picking him to win. I'm taking a couple shots on Marc-Andre Barriault, but nothing really all that significant in terms of my overall exposures. Next fight, Cub Swanson against Andre Fili. And I think this is a pretty good spot for Fili. Cub Swanson is technically coming off a win against Hakeem Dawodu, but it was a fight that I thought Dawodu won. The majority of people thought he won as well. If I remember correctly, there was like, I don't know, 16 media members that scored this fight, and 13 of them or 14 of them scored the fight for Dawodu. So technically, it is a win for Cub Swanson, but it's not one that I looked at and be like, oh yeah, Cub Swanson still is in prime form or anything like that. Cub Swanson is 40 years old. He's going to be turning 41 later this year, especially at this weight class, 145 pounds. You just don't see guys in their 40s have that much success at the later stages of their career. So I think Andre Fili knocks out Cub Swanson. I think he's a lot more power than Swanson at this point in his career. He could also hurt Cub Swanson to the body. That's a way that we've seen Cub Swanson finish and hurt a couple times over the course of his career. It's just hard for me to reliably say that somebody's going to be massively competitive at age 40 at 145 pounds. So that's where I'm at here. I'm picking Fili to win. If this was Cub Swanson of 8 years ago, then yeah, I'd feel differently about the fight, but that's not. Cub Swanson's 40 years old. And Andre Fili also not all that popular, 25% owned. Another one of those fighters that I like targeting in the mid-range this week. Let's see what we have next on the card. The next one was Charles Jourdain against Gene Silva. I think there's a pretty good leverage play on this fight in Charles Jourdain. Gene Silva is currently projected by us to be one of the most popular fighters on the card. We've got Silva projected for, 33% ownership projected for Silva. And then on the other side, we have Jourdain projected for just 22% ownership. And I'm picking Jourdain to win this fight. We've seen time and time again some of these contender series fighters that don't really end up looking all that great, especially when we have limited amount of data on them. So Gene Silva was in a relatively competitive decision win on the contender series, but it was against a very low-level opponent. And then he makes his UFC debut. He takes on Weston Wilson. Sure, he knocks out Weston Wilson, but what does that tell us? Everybody knocks out Weston Wilson other than Jekka Sergi, who Wilson was able to submit in his last fight. So I think we're getting a guy in Gene Silva who's being a little bit overrated because he was given a softball matchup. He was like a minus 500 favorite. He wins the fight as he was expected to. Massive, massive step up in competition against Charles Jourdain. And Jourdain is somebody who he has a very positive striking differential in a similar way that Gene Silva does, but he's also fought much, much higher levels of competition. And Jourdain's a pretty well-rounded fighter overall. He's somebody who could grapple a little bit. We don't see him wrestle all that often. He does struggle with his takedown defense, but I don't think we've seen a whole lot from Gene Silva that should make us confident that he's going to go out and look for a wrestle-heavy game plan. I think this fight takes place on the feet. I think it's going to be fought also at a fairly high pace. I think both fighters are certainly viable, but I'm just going a little bit inverse of the field, whereas the field is playing 33% of Gene Silva and 22% of Charles Jourdain. I'm just going to flip that. I'm going to be a little bit over 30% on Jourdain, closer to 20% on Gene Silva, and get myself a little bit of leverage on the field. I'm picking Jourdain to win. Even in the decision, I think he could score pretty well because we could see him put up 120, 130 significant strikes. But I also think he's very live for a finish in this spot, especially if Gene Silva ends up being somebody who's not all that talented, which is very possible. We just haven't seen all that much of Gene Silva. So I'm going to pick Jourdain to win by third round finish, and I like him as a leverage play on DraftKings. Next fight here, it is going to be Peyton Talbott against Yanis Ghemmouri, and this is a fight that I have a bet on. I think it's the most closing line value I've ever had because when the line first opened for this fight, Peyton Talbott opened as a minus 380 favorite. And it's very rare that you could say that like, oh, minus 380 favorite has a lot of value. But I went out, I bet Peyton Talbott minus 380 as much as DraftKings would let me bet. And now Peyton Talbott is nearly a minus 2,000 favorite. As a result, he's $9,800 on DraftKings. I wouldn't bet Peyton Talbott at minus 2,000, wouldn't even include him in a parlay because it's not going to add very much value. And you never know. He could fall off the stool or blow out his knee or something like that. But you have to pick Peyton Talbott to win. I think you have to pick him to win by finish. The only question becomes at $9,800, do we want to play him on DraftKings? And the answer to me is kind of. Like if I had the salary to get up to him, cool. I'll fit Peyton Talbott into a lineup, but it is kind of hard to do it at a $9,800 price tag. I have Talbot in. I was able to get him into 27% of lineups, but like nothing where I feel like I have to go out of my way to get Peyton Talbott into lineup. So if I'm running the Sims and just whatever lineups he shows up in, that's cool. I'm not going to boost him to force him into more lineups or anything like that. But Peyton Talbott, pick him to win by finish. I don't have too much to add to this fight. It's a layup matchup for Peyton Talbott. I don't even understand why this fight was booked. It's a big step down in competition for Talbott, who looked great in his last fight against Cameron Simone. It's just the price tag becomes a little bit prohibitive to get him into like a massive amount of lineups. If you do look at our fantasy point projections here, we've got Talbott project for 95 fantasy points, which is by far the most of any fighter on the card. It's just the salary becomes a little bit of an issue. Picking Talbott to win, if he gets the first round finish bonus or the first minute finish bonus, then yeah, there's a good chance he ends up being optimal. It's just not the most likely scenario. I'll play some of Talbott, just not going crazy. Next fight, it is Michelle Waterson-Gomez against Jillian Robertson. And it's really kind of like what I said about Cub Swanson. It's really difficult to reliably pick fighters at this kind of age at lower weight classes to be competitive. And Michelle Waterson is now, 38 years old. She turned 38 a few months ago. She's fighting at 115 pounds. She's fighting also somebody in Jillian Robertson, who's significantly younger, is making improvements to her game. And Jillian Robertson also tends to be a pretty good DraftKings scorer in her wins because Jillian Robertson is very reliant on wrestling, grappling, and winning by submission. So anytime you see a win by Jillian Robertson, it usually scores like 95 to 115 fantasy points on DraftKings. And on the flip side, when Michelle Waterson wins, it's usually kind of a boring striking affair. And we haven't seen her win very often. She has won, let's see. Yeah, her last win came in 2020, so 4 years ago. And before that, she hadn't won since March of 2019. So she has one win in the last 5 years at 38 years old. I have to pick Robertson to win. I'm going to pick her to win by submission. She's a good target on DraftKings at $8,700. I'm not necessarily prioritizing her because there are a lot of other mid-range fighters that I like, but Robertson's the pick. I don't have really any interest in Waterson for DraftKings purposes. And then Robertson, somebody who I'll have some exposure to, but not going crazy on her or anything like that. Andrei Arlovski against Martin Budai. And this is probably going to be a really shitty heavyweight fight. Budai has numerous advantages here, but time and time again, he's shown that he's not the best DraftKings scorer. Martin Budai does land 5.17 significant strikes per minute. He is a good wrestler and grappler. He just never goes to it. So he has never been taken down. He has 100% takedown defense. The problem is just the lack of offensive wrestling, landing 0.26 takedowns per 15 minutes. If you told me that Martin Budai was going to come out with a wrestle-heavy game plan, I'd be playing him in DraftKings. I'd probably bet him to win by submission as well. It is something I'm considering. I just can't rely on it because he never does it. And we see him in so many fights where he has wrestling advantages and he never goes to it. In the fight against Shamil Gaziev, he was getting absolutely pieced up on the feet. And you have to think, all right, come on, man, go shoot a takedown. Try to stay alive. Didn't. Just gets the absolute shit beaten out of him before he's not able to continue anymore. He did shoot for a takedown against Josh Parisian and then quickly thereafter got a submission. That's the only takedown he's landed in his entire run in the UFC. So I think probably happens here is Budai most likely wins a very boring decision where he pushes Arlovski up against the fence and lands some kind of like pitter-patter strikes that are counted as strikes but not significant strikes. Probably scores like 85 to 90 fantasy points in a win, which is fine, but probably not good enough to win a DraftKings tournament. So Budai by decision. That's what I'm going with. Andrei Arlovski, not somebody I really have interest in taking shots on as an underdog this weekend. Ray Satsura taking on Carlos Hernandez, and Satsura seems to be a pretty good prospect. He is undefeated, not that much experience. We've only seen him fight against low-level opponents to this point. If you do look at his numbers so far in the UFC, although not technically in the UFC because it was on the road to the UFC show, we saw him very aggressively look for takedowns. And as a result, these are fights that would have scored very well for DraftKings scoring. Win by a submission, a win by decision where he did land 8 takedowns. And then his last fight, he also wins by first round finish where he landed a takedown, held a bunch of top control time. He had 2.5 minutes of control time, lands 41 strikes as well. I do have big questions about the striking ability of Ray Satsura. And there is a scenario here where he gets clipped on the feet by Carlos Hernandez. But the reason I don't think that's the most likely scenario is while Hernandez is an overall well-rounded fighter, he does struggle to defend takedowns. It's like the one weakness to his game. And considering we know what the strategy of Satsura is in pretty much all of his fights. Or sorry, Tsuruya. I was saying Satsura there. I think that we see him land takedowns here. He's very aggressive looking for him. From what we've seen on the road to UFC, he lands 6.84 takedowns per 15 minutes. With Hernandez only defending takedowns at a 65% clip, I think Tsuruya at some point is going to be able to get on top and probably ends up submitting Carlos Hernandez. He is one of my favorite pay-up options on the slate. I have him in 35% of my lineups right now, which is slightly overweight to the field, who's projected to have him in 33% of lineups. Final fight on the card, and it is another one that I have a bet on. Ricky Simone against Vinicius Oliveira. And the bet that I have here, I have under 2.5. I bet it at minus 115 earlier in the week. The line has moved a little bit. I still think it's playable, though. I think this fight finishes. Nearly every single Oliveira fight over the course of his career has ended up finishing inside the distance. He doesn't have the best cardio. He's also not that much of a minute winner. And he also has zero takedown defense, like we've said about a handful of other fighters on this card. So in the last fight we saw out of Vinicius Oliveira, which was his UFC debut, he was losing a lot of the fight against Bernardo Sopai. Sopai ended up taking that fight on short notice, and his cardio looked very, very bad in that fight. If there was a fight that Sopai had more time to prepare for, I'm pretty confident he ends up winning. But instead, we saw Sopai. Let's go to the per round stats. So round one, he lands 2 takedowns, has nearly 2 minutes of control time, outstrikes Oliveira 33-9. Second round, another one where we saw Sopai land a takedown, nearly 3 minutes of control time, outstrikes Oliveira 46-36. But here's what happens. The wheels start falling off of Sopai at the end of the second round. He's clearly very gassed. By the time the third round comes around, he has nothing at all left in the gas tank, and then he just gets brutalized. Oliveira finishes him in that round. This is not going to be a fight where we see Ricky Simone gas. That is not something that ever happens with Ricky Simone. He is a tremendous gas tank, and I think he is just going to absolutely put his foot on the gas pedal against Oliveira. I think he lands takedowns at will, and I think he submits him in the first or second round. On the other side, though, Simone has been a little bit chinny at times, and Oliveira does have big power on the feet, so you could see a scenario where Oliveira could clip Ricky Simone going in for a takedown. So that's the main reason that I'm betting the under 2.5 here, is I think either Simone wins by submission, where he's just able to land a bunch of takedowns and wear out Vinicius Oliveira, or I think Simone gets knocked out on way to landing one of those takedowns. I think the most likely scenario, though, is that Simone does enact a very wrestle-heavy game plan and ends up scoring very well on DraftKings. So he's my most rostered pay-up option. I have Ricky Simone in nearly half of my lineups right now, and he's projected for pretty modest 28% ownership. So I'll be rooting pretty hard for Ricky Simone. Oliveira's worth taking some shots on as an underdog, but Simone, my pick to win, pick him to win by submission. And that's going to do it for me this week. If you haven't done it, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you want to sign up for our Sims tool, you could build your lineups on our site, up to 10,000 of them. You could simulate them 40,000 times in our Sims tool, and that'll help you identify some of the best lineups to play, as well as avoiding some of the lineups that are heavily duped. So if you want to sign up for that, links below in the description box. There's some other free squares out there that you guys should be aware of as well. If you want to sign up at Underdog, they have a prop this weekend over under 0.5 significant strikes for Alex Pereira. So if you haven't signed up at Underdog, there's a link to sign up for that below as well. It's a free square. Take advantage of it over at Underdog. That's an offer for new users as well as existing users. Other than that, guys, thank you very much for watching. Like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and enjoy UFC 303.